What is up, most distinguished viewers of this channel? So today we are going to do some experimenting, because that's what I like to do, on welding a continuous bead versus multiple starts and stops, and why you probably don't want to do the second one of those. So let's get into it. So if you've watched any videos on this channel where I do cut and etches, or mainly the break tests of welds, you've noticed a trend, and that is when you start welding and when you stop, the fusion is different than in the majority of the weld. AKA the start of your weld on a fillet weld like what I have here will be cold and the fusion will be poor for that first 3/8 of an inch or so, then everything's fine. And then at the end, typically penetration and fusion increases because you're carrying a lot of heat and there's nowhere for that heat to escape. Well, the same can be held true to just stacking tacks, where if you're MIG welding, where you just do like little tack welds, that's about the worst you could do. But also equally not as good is to do little 3/4 or 1 inch long welds and then stop and then restart. And one of the things when you're learning to weld that you're going to really suck at is doing long, continuous, straight welds. Universally, the hardest thing about learning to weld is basically perfecting a simple, straight stringer bead. It's difficult. And that's why, like, especially if the weld was, say, a foot long, you're going to have multiple starts and stops until you get the muscle memory or the technique down to slide your hand in the MIG gun in order to do one continuous weld. You should always strive to have one continuous weld on something. In a lot of cases, that's not possible, like roll cage tubing, exhaust, etc. Unless you have a rotary positioner or something along that line, you're kind of SOL on that. But on simple flat welds, something you're making where you have like a 6-inch long weld, it's in your best interest to do that in one shot, not 4 or 5 starts and stops. And I get it. You're going to be welding something where you have to stop. Maybe your hand's on fire, your pants are on fire, or you're just, you can't see what you're doing. And rather than just continuing motoring on and then putting down a bad weld, you got to grind out, that you stop and then you restart. Well, that's why we're going to look on a very simple test, and something that you can do at home for basically cheap or nothing, is this weld here. I'm going to do at least 4 starts and stops. This one, I'm going to do a start on the end and then go all the way, one continuous movement. We are going to break both of them towards the face and look at the change in fusion. And I expect, even with the same settings, everything, that the one with multiple starts and stops, we are going to see a lack of fusion at right after every start. And that will basically make a weaker weld overall because of the inconsistent fusion. And that's one of the things you guys got to understand, is that strong welds, it comes down to consistent welds. You can have huge root penetration and fusion on half of a weld, and if the rest of it's junk, it's still no good. So you want to aim for consistent welds as much as possible. So with that said, let me get set up, and we're going to weld both of these. So we have the continuous weld on the left here, and then the start and stop here on the right. Now, one of the things I didn't do that you want to kind of be in the habit of is, if you're going to restart on a stop, you're going to want to kind of wash it back up towards the top and then come back through. I did it this way kind of to replicate what the average person might do. And it's not necessarily a good habit. For the sake of what we're going to see here, I think this may actually give us more penetration at the start than starting the arc, washing it back up, and then coming back through. And the reason is the heat is localized here. And when you come back up here and then weld back over, you're welding over a pretty thick molten pool. So basically what I'm trying to say is, I don't believe that the inconsistent fusion that should be inside of here is going to be much different doing it this way versus washing it up. However, obviously having a cleaner tie-in is important, because it gives a stronger weld, I guess, because there's basically underfill here. We don't have an appropriate weld size. But for what we're looking at today, where we're only concerned over the effect that it has on the root penetration and fusion, we should see differences between these two, and pretty significant ones at that. So here are our two welds. This was done as one continuous bead. This was done with starts and stops. When we look at this weld, the overall profile of how it broke, it's pretty consistent. Now, it did peel some of this bottom plate off more for this section where it adhered better to the top plate. But on this test, I wouldn't put too much weight on that because of how I had to press it in a shop press. The force was not equally distributed among the weld, but where it melted through, very consistent start to finish. The plate edge here was broke down. There's some root fusion there, not a lot, but there's some. So overall, not too bad. When we look at this guy, and let me zoom in. So when we look at this, there's a lot of consistency problems. Essentially, every place that a bead was restarted, we have a lack of fusion. So starting off here on the end of it, because remember, this was welded this direction, that way. This, you're looking at it in reverse. This lack of fusion, very common with all welding processes right at the start. The polished original clean plate is still there, so no fusion to the bottom plate. We move up, you see this indication here where the line of the fusion should be consistent, and it comes up out of it. This is again a lack of fusion in the root. As we restarted, it did not melt in. It's a little difficult to see, but underneath here, once again, there's a lack of fusion. It just happened to break off the top plate instead. But just like this right here, there's one under here. And then the same thing again underneath here is a lack of fusion. By simply running a straight bead without starts and stops, when you look at this, you can see the line is more or less clean. We have very consistent root fusion and maybe a little bit of penetration. That's what you want to see. So if you ever break your weld apart, don't be surprised to see this at any stop-start situation, as well as within that first 3/8 of an inch of your start. Typically you're going to have poor fusion there, and that's why on big, thick, heavy plate and even thinner plates, sometimes they use start and stop tabs. That's so that you start your weld and get welding onto the base material off of it, so this cold start issue doesn't happen on what you're welding. And this is kind of evidence as to why you would do that and why it's done. Now, from an actual strength perspective, the difference between these two welds, I would say, is not going to be an absolute huge difference, but there is a difference. So if you can avoid doing starts and stops, I would highly recommend you avoid it. All right, let's go to conclusion. So we saw that starts and stops can be a detriment to your weld strength, basically because you lose penetration at that first 3/8 of an inch. And in the case of some processes, you can have a much greater risk of starting porosity, like say 70-18. Very common to get starting porosity if anything goes wrong during the start. Well, guess what? If you had 4 restarts on a plate, all with starting porosity, now your weld's even weaker than what you saw here with the lack of fusion. So anytime you can avoid restarts and stops, it's in your best interest, but they are part of life, and that's why it's important to be able to tie in better. Now, had I started, washed back to the top, and then welded through, I don't really think that the penetration would have been much better than what you saw here. It just visually would have looked a little bit better. Now, the proper way to do a restart on a critical piece that you had to make a stop on would be to go and grind your stop down a little bit to where it's thinned out. That way, when you started on the top of it and then welded down into the valley, that you're essentially welding, preheating the area in front of your weld to where hopefully by time you hit where the root actually is, that isn't fused, that it fuses that together And that's what you're going to find on supercritical stuff, especially if you're open root welding something and you have a stop. You have to grind and feather that edge down, start up top, and then weld all the way down in to get everything to fuse together. Otherwise, even on open root, you're going to have a little lack of fusion or lack of reinforcement right at the restart, basically a poor tie-in. So it even affects open root welding, not just closed root like on a fillet weld or a lap weld. So again, good habits will only help you. Try and do long welds as long as you can. Get comfortable, be smooth, be consistent, and your welds will be better because of that. So that's what I have today. Thanks for sticking around for the video. Until next time.